The Wednesday night in February, and I was sitting at my kitchen table in Halifax with a mug of tea going cold beside me when my phone lit up with an email I almost didn't open. The subject line was 4 words, notice of dispute, estate. I almost marked it as spam. I get a lot of junk, but the sender was a law firm in Vancouver, Whitmore and Associates, and the email was addressed to me by name, my full legal name, which almost nobody uses. So I opened it. I had to read it 3 times before the words started to make sense. My grandmother's estate, the one she left when she passed 8 months ago. The condo in West Vancouver she'd owned since the 80s. The GIC accounts she'd been quietly adding to for 30 years. The whole of it, roughly $420,000, had been disbursed 6 weeks ago to a single beneficiary, and that beneficiary was my brother's wife. I set my phone face down on the table. I got up. I went to the sink and poured my tea out even though it was still half full. I stood there looking at the drain for a long time. My grandmother had raised me, not in the sentimental way people say that sometimes, but literally. My mother left when I was 6, not dramatically, just gradually, and then all at once, and my father wasn't equipped for it. So I moved into my grandmother's place in Dartmouth when I was 7 years old, and I lived there until I was 19. She was the one who drove me to school when the roads were bad. She was the one who sat in the uncomfortable plastic chairs at parent teacher nights. She was the one who stayed up with me the night before my LSATs and made me eat breakfast even when I was too anxious to want it. Her name was Heloise. Everyone called her Gran. She had one other grandchild she was close to, and that was my brother, 3 years older than me, charming in the way that men who've never been told no tend to be. He'd been living in Vancouver for the past 6 years. He and his wife, they'd been married 4 years, had bought a house out there. A nice one, from what I understood. His wife worked in marketing. My brother did something in real estate development that I never fully understood, but that seemed to involve a lot of lunches and not a lot of verifiable income. When Gran passed, I'd flown out for the funeral. It was quiet. She hadn't wanted a fuss. My brother gave a eulogy that made people cry, because he's good at that, and then we all went back to his place for sandwiches and didn't talk about the will because it felt like the wrong time. I found out a week later from the solicitor that Gran had left a handwritten will, not the formal one she'd filed with the same law firm in 2019, which had left everything to be split equally between my brother and me. A newer one, apparently, dated 8 months before she died. The solicitor told me, in a tone that suggested he was reading from a script, that the updated document left everything to my brother's wife. As the person who had provided care and support during my grandmother's final months, I had flown out to Vancouver to visit Gran 4 times in her last year. My brother had lived 20 minutes from her. I told myself it was just paperwork. I told myself there was a reason. I told myself Gran knew what she was doing. Have you ever had a moment where you chose to believe something you already knew wasn't true, just because the alternative was too painful to look at directly? That's what I did. For 8 months. I told myself there was a reason. Then the email from Whitmore and Associates arrived. Because it turned out I wasn't the only one who'd been left confused by the will. Gran had a sister, my great-aunt, who still lived in Prince Edward Island and who was in her 80s and who had been, apparently, trying to reach my brother's wife for weeks about a personal item Gran had promised her. A hand-painted tea set. Nothing of financial value, just a thing that mattered to her. Nobody had returned her calls, so she'd contacted the estate lawyer herself, and in doing so, she'd mentioned something that made the lawyer pause. She'd mentioned that she'd spoken to Gran regularly in the last 6 months of her life, that Gran had been worried, that Gran had said she was being pressured to change certain documents, that Gran had said she didn't know if she was allowed to say no. The lawyer paused. The lawyer looked at the file, and the lawyer sent me that email. My name isn't associated with the firm. I'm a paralegal, not a lawyer, which means I know just enough about estate law to understand what had possibly happened, and exactly enough to know I needed someone else to handle it. Her name was Dominique Savoy. She'd done her undergrad at Dow the same year I did, gone straight through to law school, and had spent the last 7 years doing estate litigation in Halifax. When I called her that Wednesday night, I called her personal cell, which I hate doing, but I didn't trust myself to wait until morning. She picked up on the 3rd ring. I said, "I'm sorry to call so late." She said, "What happened?" I told her about the email, about the will, about Gran's sister and PEI and what she'd told the solicitor. about the original 2019 document that split everything equally between my brother and me, about my brother's wife being the sole beneficiary of the newer handwritten version. There was a long pause. She said, "Has anyone seen the handwritten will?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Has anyone verified your grandmother's signature against a known document?" I said I didn't know that either. She said, "I need you to send me everything you have." Tonight, I forwarded her every email I received from the solicitor. I forwarded the original 2019 will document, which I'd saved in a folder I hadn't opened since September. I found a birthday card Gran had signed the previous year, her handwriting in the card, her handwriting on the envelope. And I took pictures and sent those too. Then I sat down on my couch and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember the last conversation I'd had with Gran that hadn't felt strange. And I kept coming back to March, 8 months before she died. I'd called her on a Sunday afternoon like I always did, and she'd been distracted, not confused. Gran was never confused. Her mind was sharp until the end, but distracted, like she was listening for something in another room. I'd asked if she was okay, and she'd said yes, and then she'd said something I hadn't understood at the time. She said, "You know that what I have is yours. You know that regardless of what anything says on paper. You know that, don't you?" I told her, "Of course I knew that, Gran." She said, "Good. I just needed to hear you say it." I'd thought she was being sentimental. She was 81. It had seemed like the kind of thing people say when they're starting to think about the end. I hadn't thought about it again until that moment on my couch with Dominique's number still on my screen. She called me back the following morning. She said, "I've spoken to the solicitor at Whitmore. The handwritten will was submitted by your brother's wife, directly, without going through the original firm Gran used in 2019. The submission happened 6 weeks after Gran passed. Probate moved unusually fast, which raises questions, and there's something else. I waited." She said, "The signature on the handwritten will doesn't look right." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I had a forensic document examiner take a look at the scans overnight. Preliminary only, not admissible yet. But the pressure pattern is off. The letter formation in the G is inconsistent with every other sample we have. Your grandmother was left-handed. Whoever signed this document pressed from the right." I didn't say anything. She said, "I don't want to get ahead of the evidence, but I think we need to file a caveat against the estate before anything else is moved, and I think we need to do it today." I said, "Do it." She said, "This is going to be ugly." I said, "I know." She said, "Your brother is going to be involved in this, whether or not he was the one who did it." I said, "I know." And I did know. I'd known since the night before. The part of me that had spent 8 months telling myself there was a reason had finally gone quiet. What was left wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder. Something that felt like clarity. My brother called that afternoon. I watched his name on my phone screen for 4 full rings, and then I let it go to voicemail. He called twice more within the hour, and then his wife called, and then I got a text from my brother that said, "I heard you've been talking to lawyers. You need to call me before this goes any further. You don't know the whole story." I didn't respond. I went back to work. I sat at my desk and I did my job, and I let Dominique do hers. 3 days later, she called again. She said, "The forensic examiner has submitted a preliminary report. It's what we expected. The signature is a forgery. They're confident enough to put it in writing." I asked what happened next. She said, "We file for a formal examination of the will. The estate freezes. Nothing moves until a judge looks at this. And I found something else in the meantime, something you're going to want to sit down for." I was already sitting down, but I didn't say that. She said, "Your grandmother had a separate registered account, a TFSA she opened in 2018. It wasn't part of the estate filing. It wasn't mentioned in either will, but it named a beneficiary directly, and that beneficiary was you, not your brother, not his wife, you by name with your date of birth." I said, "How much?" She said, $86,000. It passed outside of probate entirely, which means it's not subject to the dispute. It's already yours. It transferred automatically on death. Nobody touched it because nobody knew it was there. I sat with that for a moment. She said, "I think your grandmother knew something might happen. I think she planned for it." I thought about that Sunday phone call in March. What I have is yours, regardless of what anything says on paper. She'd known. Not everything, maybe, but she'd known enough. There's a moment in this kind of thing where you stop feeling like a victim and start feeling like the person who's going to see it through. I don't know exactly when it happened for me. Maybe when Dominique filed the caveat, maybe when she sent me the forensic report. Maybe it was that night in February at the kitchen table, pouring out my cold tea. But by the time my brother showed up at my door in Halifax, he flew in from Vancouver without telling me, which I think he thought would be dramatic, but mostly just told me how panicked he was. I was ready. I opened the door. I didn't step back to let him in. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before. That easy confidence he carried like a second coat was gone, or at least frayed. His wife wasn't with him. He said he needed to talk to me. He said I didn't understand what the last year had been like. He said Gran had wanted this. He said it was complicated. I let him talk. There's value in letting people tell you what they think you believe. Then I said, she was left-handed. He stopped. I said, Gran was left-handed her whole life. Whoever signed that will pressed from the right. His face did something complicated. He opened his mouth. I said, you don't need to tell me anything. Your lawyer can talk to my lawyer. But I want you to know something before you go back to Vancouver. He waited. I said, I had a conversation with Gran in March, about 8 months before she died. She told me that what she had was mine, regardless of what anything said on paper. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I do now. He said, Kezia, that's my name. Kezia. He only uses it when he's scared. I said, she left me the TFSA, directly, by name. It transferred automatically. Nobody got to touch it. She made sure of it. I watched him work out the math. The cash accounts, the condo, those were tied up in the estate dispute, which could take months or longer. But the TFSA was already mine, clean, no contest. Gran had divided things very carefully. He said, we didn't know about that. I said, I know you didn't. I stepped back and closed the door. Not a slam, just a close, the quiet, definitive kind. He flew back to Vancouver the next morning. The hearing was 4 months later. Estate litigation in Nova Scotia takes time. It grinds, it documents, it accumulates, and what Dominique's team built in those 4 months was meticulous. The forensic examiner testified to the signature discrepancy. Gran's GP submitted records indicating she'd expressed concern to her doctor about feeling pressured in the year before her death. Her GP had noted it professionally and quietly in language that became very important in a courtroom. Gran's sister from PEI testified via video link from her living room in Charlottetown. She was 83 and she did not mince words. She said Gran had called her crying in January of that year, which had been unusual because Gran did not cry easily. She said Gran had told her that certain people in the house were pushing her toward things she didn't want to do. She said Gran had used the word pushing. My brother's wife sat through all of it with her hands folded. The judge was not interested in what anyone felt. She was interested in what could be demonstrated, and what was demonstrated piece by piece was that the handwritten will bore a forged signature, that my grandmother had expressed distress about coercion to 2 separate people in the year before her death, and that the document had been submitted by a single interested party without independent verification. The original 2019 will was reinstated. The estate was split between my brother and me as Gran had intended. The condo is being sold. Half the proceeds come to me. Combined with the TFSA, it's enough to do something real with. Enough to stop worrying about my student loans in the way I've been worrying about them for 6 years. Enough to start thinking differently about what the next decade looks like. My brother and I have not spoken since he appeared at my door. His wife sent me a single email 2 weeks after the hearing that said she was sorry for how everything had gone. I read it once. I didn't respond. I'm not sure what I feel about my brother. That's the honest answer. I don't think he forged the signature himself. I think he let his wife convince him this was easier, cleaner, less complicated than splitting things. I think he told himself a story about what Gran would have wanted. I think he's still telling it. What I feel more clearly is what I feel about Gran. About a woman who sat in plastic chairs at parent-teacher nights and who made me eat breakfast before my LSATs and who, sometime in the last year of her life, when she understood what was happening around her, quietly opened an account and put my name on it. Who called me in March and made sure I knew. She couldn't stop what was being built around her, but she made sure there was something I'd be able to find. That's the thing about people who love you without condition. They think about you even when they're the ones who need protecting. I flew to PEI in the spring, after it was all over, to visit Gran's sister. She lives in a small house outside of Summerside, with a garden that gets too much wind but that she tends anyway. I brought her the tea set. I'd found it in the condo, packed carefully in newspaper the way Gran packed everything, and she held it for a long time without saying anything. Then she said, She used to say, "You were the careful one." I said, "She told me I worried too much." She smiled. She said, "Same thing with her." I drove back to the airport with the window down despite the cold, which is very unlike me, and I thought about all the things that look like worry and are actually love, all the ways people plan for you in the dark, before you even know you need it. I thought about roots and what that word actually means, not what holds you down, what holds things together underground, quietly, in ways you can't see until you need them. Gran planted things. She just didn't always tell you where.